All righty, episode 30 of the Gurupresario podcast. I'm here with Lee Merritt. Drove down from Dallas this morning, yeah?
Yep.
Glad to have you, Lee. I'm going to let you kind of introduce yourself to the audience, let us know kind of your background, and then we'll jump in it.
Okay. At my leisure?
At your leisure, my friend.
Okay, great. Well, my name is Lee Merritt. I'm a civil rights attorney, and I'm running for Texas Attorney General. I am originally from California. I have a background as a educator, actually. I began my educational career in Camden, New Jersey, at the time the most dangerous city in America, notoriously. I went there because I thought that was where I was most needed as a young black inner city educator. I liked the challenge. I had a great time in Camden, but I found that there were limitations on what I could do for my community, and particularly around the area of housing, which is where I got my start as an organizer, helping in the classroom, teaching students, but then taking on some community concerns in terms of affordable housing, and ran into some roadblocks, long story short, and went to go back to law school to get a better education in civil rights. I got my degree in law school. I joined the Cochran firm in Philadelphia initially, and I wanted to take that training to where I thought civil rights workers were needed the most, and that's what brought me to Texas.
How'd you get into the Cochran firm, man?
Oh, well, I actually interned for the Cochran firm as a young kid. As a law student, but grew up admiring Johnny Cochran. Grew up during the trial of the century. It was really one of my major inspirations for wanting to become a civil rights attorney and a people's advocate. And so watched that firm as it grew throughout the years, and was really honored to be able to have that as my first job out of law school.
Amazing. Camden, New Jersey. Tell me a little about Camden. What's the difficulty there?
Well, I left Morehouse in Atlanta, Georgia, 2005, and I wanted to teach in an inner city community where I could work on closing the educational achievement gap. And so I asked them, where was I most needed? And Camden at the time was the poorest city in America. It's right there on the border of Philadelphia. It was an economically depressed city, but a city full of culture, mostly Puerto Rican and Dominican in terms of the population, one of the largest concentrations of Puerto Rican and Dominican populations on the East Coast. And so it took me out of my comfort zone.
More than New York, the city?
The city itself per capita, right?
Okay.
And that's the other tricky thing. Camden is the most dangerous city in America, not because they have the most violent crimes, but because it's such a small city with nothing else going on, right? And so per capita, one of the largest concentrations of Puerto Rican and Dominican. Yeah.
Amazing. I appreciate the insight and the background, and I know our audience definitely does. I want to jump in it because you're running you're a candidate for Texas Attorney General.
That's right.
There's some motivation, obviously, that kind of goes behind that. I want to learn a little about that.
Sure. Well, advocating for families in Texas, I really found that there was such a huge need, an organizational need, a civil liberties protection need in Texas. And so one of my first major cases was in the city of Fort Worth. And just some of the institutional problems. It's one thing to see, an officer or someone involved in misconduct or a constitutional violation. It's another thing to see a system built around it that insulates malfeasance, that insulates bad policing, that insulates policies that are detrimental to community growth. And so fighting people like Ken Paxton on issues of transparency and access to resources for our communities, I found myself banging my head against a wall for a while, and I realized that we needed better people in that position. And so I honestly began looking for folks who would be willing to take on that role and folks that I could support. And there weren't a lot of people standing up. Democrats have struggled finding quality candidates for that office. Mind you, I think that there was a phenomenal candidate in Justin Nelson, a Harvard graduate, someone who has some civil rights background as well in the last election. But he didn't have the platform or the movement behind him to generate enough support to overcome someone like Ken Paxton with the name recognition and the support of his party. And so I decided that I could run myself.
Yeah. Tell me a little about the support that you have that gives people like myself a little hope.
Well, I've been working in the area of civil rights around the country for most of my career. If we look at even within the last year, I thought it was sort of a climax of some of the struggles that we've been engaging in. They call it a national reckoning on police reform. And we were able to, speak with people on both sides of the aisle. We were able to meet with the Trump White House and meet with William Barr and some of the law enforcement leaders from around the country and begin to look at things that we agree on. It turns out there's a lot more than we agree on than folks understand, but we're not allowed to have those conversations. Spoke before the United States Senate, and that conversation about policing and accountability and reform took center stage in the country, and we found that when I say we, my law firm found that the nation was looking to us for leadership. They were looking for us for best practices and policies because we had built a niche as people who could work on in places like Texas and work with Republican leaders and work with Democratic leaders. And so over the year, we've built up not only a social media following of hundreds and thousands of followers and supporters, but a nationwide network of activists. And you would be surprised. So one of the people that I would list as someone that we work with, for example, is the president of the chief of the state troopers, Chief Steve McGraw. And he and I have developed a relationship over the years because when something terrible happens in Texas, it's he and I who are having the conversation. And like I said, we found that, for example, we agree that law enforcement officers shouldn't be responding to mental health calls, right? That's not what they should be doing, and they're overwhelmed by it, and it's impacting not only the community but the profession itself. And we've come up with solutions that we think actually work.
Right. You obviously have a lot of experience in that ground in terms of policing the right way, disciplining police in the right manner. What are the disconnections that maybe it's in Texas, right? Or maybe you could give us insight to the United States in general. But what are some of the disconnects that do not allow a police department to properly implement policies or create a culture that is really there for protecting citizens of that state?
Well, it's the myth that being tough on crime is anti-people. Essentially, it's the idea that in order to maintain law and order, that we have to use tactics that are militarized. That we can't deal with, for example, the crack pandemic, which was a major feature of the growth of our current criminal justice system, the same way that we're trying at least to deal with the opioid crisis, which was with compassion and resources. I think when we're able to change the narrative of when we stop looking at communities as hostile combatants and look at them as, all right, this is a community in need who has a very specific sort of catalyst for their problem. Let's address the problem with tactics that work, not with mantras or rhetoric that fuel our base. I honestly think more than anything, if we had a proper discussion, for example, again, the reason we see such different tactics in the opioid crisis than we did with the crack pandemic is because the language that we use around it is this is a mental health emergency, not a public safety emergency. We didn't criminalize the children of opioid addicts, right?
Right.
And so I think the language has a lot to do with it.
Right. Is there a disconnect with these? So most recently, the city had voted on Proposition, I think it was Proposition B, which was
when you say the city, what city were
City of San Antonio, specifically because there's a contract with the police union that that pretty much limits, I guess, what the police chief can do in terms of disciplinary action. I think the city of San Antonio, there is some history there of rehiring police officers that have been toxic to the department, and I'm sure that there's language out there where the chief talks about this, but where he's kind of handcuffed in that manner. Do you have any insight in terms of cities that are dealing with those contracts with the police union?
Yeah, and so I mentioned going up to the White House last year and speaking with the Trump White House and William Barr, who was the U.S. Attorney General at the time. And the other feature in the room, besides the 9 families that I brought with me, including family of Ahmaud Arbery and Botham Jean, Damian Daniels, a lot of Texas families were there, was the police union captains. And where we found agreement, where William Barr and Senator Tim Scott and I found agreement, the police unions were there to say, no, there's no way we're ending qualified immunity. That'll flood our departments with litigation, which, we pointed out later in the Senate discussion that that's the problem.
Right.
That if allowing the law to apply equally to police officers would flood our courtrooms and clog our courtroom system, that means that we have a real problem. That means that we are, in fact, what the data bears out, the deadliest police culture in the modern world. We are, that the largest prison in population in human history,
Right.
has in fact become a problem. But yeah, those unions and those contracts, the collective bargaining agreements is one of the biggest detriments that I find to police accountability and actual reform. And it ties the hands of progressive law enforcement officers. So when they want to do the right thing, the unions step in and say, no, we're going to protect our officers above the rights of the citizens. And again, the Attorney General's office being the lead law enforcement office, not only lead law enforcement office, but the lead negotiator in the state of Texas, can come in and say, these contracts don't work for our communities. These contracts don't actually serve the outcomes that we're looking for. And we definitely need to go in and begin to renegotiate and in some cases pull out of those contracts altogether.
Right. I agree on that. The Attorney General's office has various responsibilities, right, to the citizens of the state.
Yep.
Tell us a little about that. Maybe some of the disconnects that currently the office of Ken Paxton has with the actual narrative that's there.
Absolutely. I love to talk about the power of that office because the truth is there's virtually no aspect of Texas life that the Attorney General's office doesn't touch. That's a 4,000 employee office, a $1.26 billion budget, 750 lawyers, 37 divisions. And I think the time that we all felt the sort of the negligence universally occurring in that office was just last February during the winter storm. We have remained locked into contracts with ERCOT that pass on costs to consumers, that maintain a grid that is on the fritz, that can't stand up to the slightest weather change. And weather change is real, climate change is real. And so there's so much work that can be done through the Office of Attorney General. We often think about criminal justice reform, which is a division, an important division, but it's just one of the 37 divisions. That office can be used to finally deal with the issue of property taxes in Texas. In Texas, we pay more than a third in property taxes than the rest of the nation. And it's because we have negotiated for businesses to come to Texas, and we've attracted multi-billion-dollar corporations. We continue. I'm excited about Tesla's presence in Texas and what that might mean to renewable energy. But we give them breaks and we pass the cost on to people. And it's nice to live somewhere where there's no income tax. But if we're not finding a greater tax base to cover all the other public services that we need, and again, working through the Attorney General's office to ensure that businesses are paying their fair share, we end up stuck in a system that serves corporations at the cost of people.
Definitely understand that. We know that the Attorney General's office does work closely with the governor's office, correct?
Hypothetically, right?
Hypothetically, correct. There are some announcements, right? Beto's going to run for Texas governor. I haven't heard of many more.
Has he announced it yet?
I don't know if he's announced it. Maybe it's a rumor, right?
Yeah.
What do you see in that in hindsight? What do you see with that in terms of, hey, if there is a candidate that's going to run that you could work next to, great, give us some insight of that. Or if not, if Governor Abbott gets reelected, how are you going to work through that?
Sure.
How are you going to navigate those fields?
Well, first, we've been having a Republican attorney general and governor in Texas since like the last time the Cowboys won the Super Bowl. And so under Republican leadership, we've seen that office being abused to push a far right-wing conservative agenda. Right now, there have been lawsuits filed against our public school system. 6 of our public schools were recently sued so that they couldn't institute the CDC recommended.
Right, to protect children.
Right.
Protect children.
During a deadly pandemic.
Right.
So the Attorney General's office should be being used to do the opposite. You think the AG steps in during times of national emergency and they come up with a plan to protect Texans. But instead, we're pushing this conservative agenda that doesn't help anybody.
They're being hyper-political, right. I think, in the sense of their position.
And that AG, the top cop, should be telling the governor, all right, we have this this program that we're trying to run on behalf of Republicans and our conservative agenda, but we have to be constrained by the limits of the Constitution. There is no constitutional cop in our government, right? There's no one saying, hey, setting bounty hunters out on Texas women is probably not a good thing.
Right.
Not only is it morally wrong, but it's constitutionally unsound. I can't believe no one had that conversation with the Texas legislator or the governor in many of his gubernatorial overreach, right? From the border to telling businesses that they shouldn't social distance in order to, there's so many issues that could have been resolved if the governor's office simply had someone saying, look, the Constitution is actually a real thing and applies to in Texas, right? It's the Lone Star State, but we still operate under the United States Constitution,
right,
in our own Constitution. I could work with any governor to do that. I would love to see a progressive governor so that we could go after policies that I think will be better for Texans, and that's what we're fighting for. You mentioned Beto O'Rourke. He and I have worked together and talked about the importance of protecting voters, voter registration, and getting people to participate in the system. I think if we pay attention to what the data is telling us, and particularly the census data from 2020. The vast majority of Texans want to see a more progressive agenda from the government, but we need more participation in the system. If we had more participation in the system in the last election for Attorney General, it was decided by less than 4%, 3.6% of the vote. So I like anybody, including Matthew McConaughey, that would encourage people to participate in the system, to show up in the elections. Because if we show up in the elections, the people of Texas, their voice will be heard, and we can start to deal with long-term systemic issues in Texas that have been set aside for a far right-wing agenda. But I can also see that office being used to check some of the conservative power. If Abbott is able to maintain that office, then we need some sort of checks and balances in place. We need a attorney general who you can be. And I know it's just hard to believe, but you can be bipartisan in that position. It is a law office.
Right. Right.
It's not actually designed to do what Ken Paxton is doing, which is sue other states on behalf of Donald Trump. Those kind of priorities is not the priorities for most Texans.
Right.
And I'm excited about the gubernatorial race and who runs, but I think we have a real chance to win at the AG's race, and that's true for all the positions. If we show up, I think Democrats can win. They could run the gambit, but certainly this office is vulnerable, in that we need someone in place that will serve as an advocate for the constitutional rights of Texans.
Right. What do you specifically? We talked about, right? There was a 3.6% gap on that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people out there, and I bring this up all the time when I have someone. I had Diego Bernal recently, a few others, but I bring it up. What do you say to those individuals, specifically the younger guys? Because I was that guy where I didn't believe in the voting system, and I felt like whatever I did really didn't matter. Mm-hmm. What do you have to say to those young, I would say the younger generation, right? I've met some older folks too, but I've gotten lectured by the older folks more than the younger guys. Yeah. What do you say to them, man?
I think they call them Gen Zs now.
Probably.
Yeah, and what the census data has told us is that their participation in the voting process and the elections has actually grown. We're hard on Gen Z, but they were the largest group. 18 to 22 was the largest growth. It grew by 6%, more than any other dynamic in Texas. So they're paying attention and they're tuned in. We have to get the message to them. We got to show up to the college campuses. We need to show up to the high schools even, and begin to inform them both about their rights and about how our government works. Now, there are forces even within the current Texas leadership who is trying to prevent.
Yep. Tell us a little about that.
About how our education system is under attack.
Yeah.
We'll start with, and I don't know that people fully appreciate this, but my background is as an educator. I started with Teach for America out of undergrad. And what I learned, and the reason I came to Texas first as a Dallas ISD recruiter. I'm trying to attract educators to Texas. 1 out of 10 students in all of America are educated right here in Texas. And how education goes in Texas, it will go for the rest of the country. Why? Because publishers have understood that these huge school systems in Texas, Harris County, Dallas County, Bexar County, these huge school systems in Texas set the market standard. It starts off west here in Texas and moves throughout the rest of the country. So whatever we allow in our books, whatever random, and I call it random agitation of the language that we've been hearing most recently is CRT. I'm not sure what that is. As an educator, like, I know what they're calling it, but I recently saw a principal in Grand Prairie suspended and potentially terminated because he sent a letter out to his students about them dealing with George Floyd, right? Which is something that we all dealt with as a community. How seeing that kind of thing impacted them, and ways that they could deal with it and avoid that kind of thing happening in their communities. And they said, well, that's CRT. That's
for the audience that doesn't. That's critical racial theory.
Yeah, that's critical race theory. And we've seen it at a local level where there's a groundswell of this new Tea Party, new Trumpian movement, that anything that is talking about progress or unity or growth, intolerance, diversity, and include. I actually heard on Fox recently someone said, diversity and inclusion is the new code language for leftist, liberal, communist takeover. It's like, no, diversity and inclusion means still diversity.
It's the U.S. This is the U.S. We're diversity and inclusive.
Right.
I agree.
And so, ground zero for the fight for Texas, it starts with education, and conservatives realize that, and they're trying to push an agenda that's not even a popular agenda, but it's certainly popular among their base. And our classrooms are on the battleground now, and again, we need an attorney general who will protect our teachers, protect our students, in a way it won't. More importantly, just won't use them as a political pawn. We want to get resources to our school. We want to ensure they have safe and fully funded learning environments. Politics shouldn't be in the game of what our students learn about history, for example.
I agree. There are two big things in the news, and I do want to bring these up before we're piling out of here. Right, we got a luncheon here soon, but two big things happening in Texas. Right, one of them was and I'm a gun advocate. Right, I may not seem like it, but I do want to get your take on your position on kind of how you see this new movement that happened in Texas, where it's anybody could carry, not necessarily need to be licensed. I recommend you're educated or know some type of fundamental process in terms of being a person who carries. But what are your views? Is this the right move for the state, or?
I've recently become. I wouldn't call it a gun enthusiast. I'm a gun owner. Yeah. I take my kids to the gun range. I want them to learn about gun safety. I think there's a cultural aspect to it. Certainly, a hunting culture that I think that we both should respect, and I'm interested in learning more about. But we have to deal with the reality that America is number one in gun violence, and Texas is the lone star state in that regard. It's a standout state. And so at a time where gun violence is on the rise around the country, was it particularly wise to say this is a great time to deregulate the gun ownership? Now, without licensing, without training. That training was important to me. I learned about the importance of, for example, locking that gun away and getting my kids familiar with having a weapon around the home and teaching them basic safety tips to ensure that our children aren't harmed. So I have nothing against gun ownership, but the irresponsible idea that, and again, it was just to feed their base. It was just to encourage, the right-wing conservatives that Obama and his prodigy won't take their guns. It was a problem that never existed, and now we've compounded the problem that in fact does exist. The problem is in fact gun violence and gun competency. I think if anything, we should be seeing legislation that makes it easier for people to get access to gun training, not just access to guns.
I agree. So, for the record, people should not have their guns taken away.
No, people should not have their guns taken away.
Good. I know there's going to be a lot of people out there that are, if he's a Democrat, then he wants the guns taken away. And it's just like...
Yeah, and I get that inclination. I look at somebody like my good friend Beto O'Rourke, who has taken a strong stance that a lot of people feel anti-gun. But he came out of... He's a representative of El Paso. And someone has to pay attention to these national tragedies and stop just simply moving on.
Right.
And he he took a hard line, a position against gun ownership and gun access, particularly these AR-15s and other weapons that could cause that has been at the heart of mass shootings that we've seen around the country. You know, that is a concern, and I appreciate that someone has the bravery to speak about it, because that's sacrilege in Texas. But there's a line that we can walk between gun ownership, gun competency, and protecting the Second Amendment. I'm a constitutional lawyer. I believe in our right to bear arms, but we need to do it in a way that makes Texas more safe, not less.
Right. Agreed on that. Second point to that is the issue of abortion. The issue of abortion. I feel that women are being stripped of their right to have an abortion or not.
Yeah.
I'm a big advocate for that. I do believe that these women should have their choice in whatever they want to do. Right. Don't get me wrong. I'm a God-fearing man for whatever that means.
And there's no conflict there.
Right.
And it's a false conflict.
Right.
My position on abortion has nothing to do with a bounty hunter law that allows people from outside of the state, outside of the country, people who have no standing in these cases, to bring lawsuits against families, against rape victims. Abortion is going to be a tragedy. And sometimes it will be a medical necessity. Sometimes it will have everything to do with the specific circumstances of the person who has to make the choice. But 50 years of precedent since Roe v. Wade, which remains the law of the land, says that women get to choose.
Right.
They say that it's a constitutional right. So if we talk about the Second Amendment, we should talk about the First, which includes our privacy rights.
Right.
And women have a right to make medical decisions. Right now, instead of pitting each other against each other in terms of our views, and say, that there's this idea that on the right, we're protecting the unborn, and on the left, we're protecting women's rights. If we really cared about women's health, then we wouldn't allow 18% of our population to have no health care coverage whatsoever, including 650,000 children. If we cared about children, let's talk about take care of those 650,000 children. Let's pass laws to make sure that they have access to health care. We don't legitimately care about children.
Right.
That's not driving the policy. It's feeding our base. And I don't think it's fair that we continue to allow them to change the narrative about that. Okay, you guys care about children and health care, then why does Texas have one of the highest mortality rates? Not in the country, but in the industrialized world, right? Particularly for Black and brown women. And what does this law do to help that? It doesn't. It exacerbates the problem, because now these Black and brown women have to get backdoor abortions, have to cross county lines. And by the way, our government is sponsoring a clear violation of the Constitution. You can't just simply ignore Roe v. Wade and 50 years of precedent because it feels good to your base. It makes us the outlaws.
Do you have, maybe this isn't a question for on the record, but I want to know your view, man. The Supreme Court of the United States kind of took a back step. I think it was Sotomayor who actually is the only person who kind of spoke out against it. What do you think about that, man? It's disturbing to me. This is why I ask you.
I'm really disappointed with the Supreme Court. I mentioned that the Attorney General's office has the opportunity to be a bipartisan position because it's a law office. And, the Constitution, it says what the Constitution says. We expect the United States Supreme Court to step up and enforce the case precedent and the Constitution in all 50 states. And because that court has been so decimated by a Trump presidency that was allowed to put these really conservative ideologues on the bench who continue to use that office, that position as if it's a political position. We're faced with a Supreme Court that sat on its hands while women's rights are laid waste in Texas. It's not okay.
Right. I have a very cynical view of the road we're headed down, and I'll kind of bring it to your attention. Do you feel like democracy is maybe falling here in the U.S.?
I think it's taking some blows. I think that we're going to win, right? I think they kicked the hornet's nest. I think that at the same time they went after voting rights in Black and brown communities, they undermined the rights of the disabled communities. They sparked outrage among women. I think the groups are going to start to come together. They are starting to come together. They're going to organize, and we're going to fight back. I think what you're actually seeing is the death. Instead of the death of democracy, we're seeing the death of the Republican Party. In this sense, that is now the party of Trump. Trump is living in a fantasy world that he still won the election and that he's getting back into office. Now we have the tendency to ignore Trump as a fanatical outsider. I don't think we should make that mistake again.
Right.
Pay attention to what he's doing. Prepare to fight. But I think we have everything that we need to win, and I think they're giving us the motivation every day.
Right. I agree with that. I want to finish, and I always finish the podcast with a positive message to the younger audience, right? Whether they're Republican, whether they're liberal, whatever their ideal view is, right? What type of advice do you have to the younger audience that's watching that is perhaps maybe losing hope in the idea of becoming what they want to become in life or wanting to get to where they're wanting to get? What type of advice do you have for the younger audience?
I grew up in America. I was born in 1983, and so I grew up in America that was in the midst of a crack pandemic, a racial reckoning of its own. And they told me as a kid that I could be whatever I wanted to be. Now, my father was incarcerated. My mother was a teenage mom. And everyone focused on the education. They said the policies may not be where you want them to be, and that's my message to the youth today. Policies may not be where you want them to be. Politics may not be where you want them to be, but you are literally the future. You have the opportunity to gain an education and change anything in our system that you don't like. I believe that, and because of that, I've been able to take on issues in education that bothered me as a kid. They labeled me as at risk. I didn't know what that meant. I know what it means today, but they labeled me as at risk. And I wanted to work in the educational system to close the achievement gap and provide more opportunities in our communities. I was able to do that. And out of that, I developed a new family, mostly Puerto Rican and Dominican, of young kids who are now in law school. And it blows me away because that means I'm getting really old. But they're working on changing the world. I see this next generation that we just talked about, ages 18 to 22 in Texas in particular, who are engaged in the system, who have access to resources, who will be the change that we want to see. And we see a new wave of young leaders coming along as well. I encourage them to get involved. I had a chance to work with some politicians that inspired me. I encourage those young people to join this campaign, merrittfortexas.com, show up for volunteers, and really not be afraid of the future, but take hold of it. You are the future.
That's a great message, Lee. I want to thank you for coming on. I know it wasn't an easy drive coming down from Dallas and taking the opportunity to sit down with us and have this conversation, but I know it's an important one. And you're not only a light to the state, but I think a light to the world. You definitely have a positive message, and I wish you the best in your campaign.
Thank you so much for having me. I want us to continue to have these conversations. Hopefully I'll be invited back.
I hope you're back.
We can get into some of the particulars.
You're always welcome back.
Thank you again.
All right, Lee. Thanks again.
Yeah.